The Quebec Campaign of 1776 was an unmitigated disaster that saw the near total loss of an American army and was barely saved by the frantic defense of the Hudson Valley by Benedict Arnold. Over the winter, both sides repaired, refitted, and prepared for the impending campaign. Typically, I like to start the episode out from the perspective of the American forces, but today we're going to start out not with Benedict Arnold, but instead with John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne was the savior of Canada. His arrival with new forces had driven the Americans from the gates of Quebec City and all the way back into New York. He may have even been able to capture the Hudson Valley had Benedict Arnold not done a successful fighting withdrawal. Sure, the end of the campaign wasn't the success that he had wanted, but all in all, his counterattack was extremely successful. As the winter ended, Burgoyne wanted to do more than just capture the Hudson Valley. He wanted to strike a knockout blow against the rebellion. He submitted his plans of attack to the British High Command in February of 1777, and soon received the go-ahead to commence. This is what he had in mind. Burgoyne would split his army into two parts. The large one, led by himself, consisting of about 7,200 soldiers, would push down the Hudson Valley to capture American forts, the most important one being Fort Ticonderoga. The smaller branch would head towards Albany, New York, from the west, consisting of about 1,800 soldiers. They would advance in tandem and meet back up at Albany and defeat a battered and depleted rebel army. At the same time, Burgoyne called for General Howe in New York to feint an attack north of the city to pin down American forces. The hope was that by the end of the year, the communications between New England and the southern colonies would be cut, and the rebellion would be split into two. British rationale at the time was that the New England colonies were where the most fervent revolutionary spirit was. If they could isolate that part away from the southern colonies, who appeared to be more loyalist, then perhaps it would be possible to end the rebellion more swiftly. Additionally, if surprise could be established, the American army that Benedict Arnold commanded at the time could be completely destroyed, and Washington would be totally cut off from the Northeast. This plan, if successful, could very much end the rebellion in 1777 at the earliest, or at the latest, mid-1778. I'll give it to Burgoyne. This was certainly a cunning and audacious plan. There are three problems, though, that I want to point out before we go any further. The first being that it called for the splitting of his army into two. Another issue that Burgoyne faced was the lack of intelligence and understanding both of where the position of the American forces and their composition. He knew that Arnold was out there, somewhere, but not his exact location. The lack of intelligence wasn't the worst thing. This could be remedied by scouting. The biggest glaring problem is that Burgoyne was extremely arrogant. He felt that he would be able to easily dispatch any rebel forces that he might encounter. It's understandable why he would feel this way, given what happened in Quebec, but the worst thing you can ever be as a military commander is arrogant. His final mistake was relying on Howe. The men didn't always get along too well, and so to rely on orders that he created that essentially makes Howe follow his orders was going to ruffle some feathers. What Burgoyne also did not know was that Howe's plan had also been sent to military high command and was also approved. Howe asked permission to make a push towards the city of Philadelphia, the rebel capital. His plans were also approved. So, if you're not following, Burgoyne was now relying on the assistance of a man who he didn't have the best relationship with, and who also just had his own separate command approved of. He thought the entire campaign that he would be receiving the aid of another phantom army. This will come back to bite him. On the flip side, the Americans had no clue what the British were planning. Intelligence was all over the place. Washington was aware of the situation and considered his options. He guessed that an attack centered around Burgoyne's army in the Hudson was the most likely scenario, but where exactly he would strike, or when, was the mystery. Although he did correctly point out that the center of gravity up there is Albany, so good on him. To put into perspective how faulty the intelligence was, the Continental Congress wrote to Washington that they believed that John Burgoyne was not going to strike through the Hudson Valley, and instead planned on sailing around the coast, landing in his rear to outflank him. On a side note, or I guess spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, skip ahead. This intelligence was actually really spot on, except they believed that it would be Burgoyne to do this. It was actually the plan of General Howe. So, I digress. With this faulty intelligence, Washington made probably the safest call possible. He ordered the reinforcement of the forts in the Mohawk Valley to the west and in the Hudson Valley. This is actually the exact places where Burgoyne was going to attack, so he guessed quite well. Washington dispatched about 3,500 fresh troops to the region to shore up its defenses. The outcome of the intelligence given to Washington by the Continental Congress, though, will be the topic of another video, so stay tuned then. We're not done with Washington yet. It was at this point that American General Philip Schuyler returned to command after being ill for some time. He also received reinforcements commanded by General Israel Putnam, a name you might remember from the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston. The trap was set, and now it needed someone to spring it. After many months of preparation, in early June, John Burgoyne launched his offensive. When I say launch, I should really say it was a crawl. His baggage train was over 3 miles, or nearly 5 kilometers, long. His soldiers were not equipped to fight and march through wilderness, and the whole time, the Continental forces were sabotaging the march. Whether it be from the occasional skirmish, the destruction of bridges, the felling of trees, or the lack of livestock to be plundered, this all made for quite a miserable march. While the Americans knew where Burgoyne's army was, they still didn't know its target. This is because of the Native American scouts that Burgoyne had employed as the vanguard of his army, and they did a great job of masking his exact movements. So, you can imagine the surprise of General Arthur St. Clair when he and his 3,000 men defending Fort Ticonderoga were suddenly partially surrounded and had artillery pounding their positions from the higher ground near the fort. The surprise and lack of preparation for the attack led to a swift retreat from the region. In 4 days, Burgoyne's army had taken the largest fortress on the Hudson River. While his retreat caused political turmoil, St. Clair's quick thinking had saved most of his army. While he had lost the fort in some small skirmishes, most of his army retreated back through what is today the present state of Vermont, back towards Schuyler's positions further downstream at Albany. This will have major implications for the future of this campaign. So, rather than making a lightning advance and pressing the attack on what appeared to be a wide open road towards Albany, Burgoyne decided to rest a few days, and then totally overhauled his plans, and then, after some time, began to march again. This time, though, their advance would be that of an incredibly slow crawl. The delaying tactics that I first mentioned were sent into overdrive now that the Americans knew exactly where Burgoyne was and exactly where he was going. Burgoyne made extremely slow progress over the next month, and he was even forced to build his own road through the wilderness after the colonists kept cutting down the trees in his path, and that made it even more annoying to go through in March. This was extremely time-consuming. Even still, he continued to push his men towards Albany. These weren't all the British troops on the advance, though. Remember how he had sent a large contingent of about 1,700 men to march through western New York to meet up with him at Albany? Let's see how they're doing. Lieutenant Colonel St. Ledger was leading his forces through the Mohawk Valley in western New York. Importantly for this story, about half of his men were Native American warriors from the surrounding Iroquois tribes. They knew the terrain very well, and like what happened with Burgoyne, were excellent scouts and guides. This column made good progress towards their objective, even routing an American force at the siege of Fort Stanwix. Their march was stopped, however, at Orscanny by the American forces. While the Americans forced the British from the field, they had received such horrific casualties that they also had to pull back, making this a draw. Sensing that this could have been a breaking point, Benedict Arnold immediately raised men and marched towards Fort Stanwix with about 100, and intended on rallying the surviving Americans after their commander had been mortally wounded. While this number was small, and Arnold knew it was very small, he used some clever deception and convinced the British that he had a much larger army. News of this march reached St. Ledger, and his native allies deserted him very quickly, and even took most of their supplies with them. Seeing the writing on the wall, and believing that his battered forces were now facing down a very, very powerful American force, St. Ledger began his long retreat back towards Canada. Remember defeat in detail? The British army that started out with 10,000 men had split themselves up, and now 1,700 of those men were now defeated, scattered, or were having to retreat to redeploy over a months-long march. This was a big success. Benedict Arnold turned his forces right around and marched quickly to reinforce Schuyler's army at Albany. Back in Paradise, Burgoyne's situation began to grow worse somehow. He had sent word to General Howe in New York, asking him how his march from New York City was going. He was assuming that he was going to meet up with him at Albany soon, and that their overwhelming force would crush the American forces there. He sent this letter in early June when he began his march to Albany. He opened the reply in early August as he was making his own roads through the New York wilderness. So, he had been marching for over a month. He expected to see that Howe was close by, and that the urgently needed supplies that he needed would be right around the corner. So you can imagine his surprise when he opened the letter to learn that not only was Howe not on his way, but that he had instead decided to go and box Washington in Philadelphia. I really wish I could go back in time and hear his reaction. Burgoyne's panic was apparently so bad that he did not share with his officers this development until the campaign had already progressed much further than this point. Knowing that he now needed to secure a new source of supply, he divided his army again and dispatched 1,000 soldiers under the command of Colonel Friedrich Baum to go into what is present-day Vermont and raid a few towns and bring back supplies. What he did not know is that that force commanded by General St. Clair, who he had pushed out of Ticonderoga, had now reinforced and rebuilt his army. When Baum left, he was soon surrounded and annihilated at the Battle of Bennington. To make matters even worse, his native allies, seeing the writing on the wall, left him as well. By the beginning of August, Burgoyne was now left with 7,000 men and no supplies. The Americans were not idle, though. The Continental Congress had dispatched General Horatio Gates to take over command from Schuyler. Gates was very arrogant, and the difference between him and Schuyler could be felt immediately. When he arrived, he refused to include Schuyler in his war council and did not want to use him in the preparations for his own campaign. Gates in the Continental Congress saw Schuyler as incompetent for giving up Ticonderoga. Eventually, Washington recalled Schuyler back to him in preparation for Howe's advance on Philadelphia, though more on that in a later video. Gates continued to grow his army. His numbers were bolstered by militia, Arnold's army arriving from the west, General Lincoln's fresh companies, and the army from Bennington. Gates' army now numbered more than 10,000 men. they received fresh supplies as well. He also received a Polish man by the name of Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko hailed from Poland and was in charge of setting up the defense works. He picked a series of hills and had the soldiers create trenches, gun emplacements, and other obstacles. This American army was well provisioned, well supplied, and well dug in just south of Saratoga, New York. Burgoyne had no clue what he was walking into. He still believed that he'd be receiving supplies when his detachment of men returned. When Burgoyne arrived at the American lines, he arrived in force and immediately slammed into the American left flank. He realized that if he could break through there and roll it backwards, he could outflank the rest of the men in quick order, although he did not know exactly how large his army was he was facing. His three columns fought viciously and eventually forced the Americans to begin to pull back, though they did not fall back as far as he needed. Gates's men retreated to more lines behind them, and while bending, they importantly did not break. By the end of the day, the British had captured their objective, but had lost so many men that their newly captured positions were untenable. Burgoyne ordered them and the rest of the army to fall back towards Saratoga to regroup and receive the reinforcements he believed were arriving soon. He had received word that General Clinton, who Howe had left to New York, was launching an attack up the Hudson from the south that would at least peel off some American soldiers, and hopefully they would arrive, give him the supplies, and they could surround the American army. Clinton had major successes at the beginning. His 3,000 men made their way up the Hudson, and he was sending letters to Burgoyne to hold out just a little longer because he was making good progress. He was, though, eventually turned around and forced to retreat. All of his letters to Burgoyne, telling him that he was retreating, though, were intercepted and never reached him. Realizing now that help probably wasn't going to be able to get there quick enough, Burgoyne made plans to retreat. What he didn't realize was that the Americans were planning a massive attack. On the afternoon of October 7th, Burgoyne launched a 1,700-man reconnaissance and force mission to test out the American lines to see if they were still there. These 1,700 men slammed into the left flank of the American army, which by now was advancing on his position with 15,000 men. During the fighting, General Fraser, one of Burgoyne's most trusted men and one of his very good friends, was mortally wounded. All sides of his forces began to buckle under the immense and overwhelming force in front of him. He ordered a retreat to his entrenchments near Saratoga, but his messenger was shot dead in front of him. The British continued to fall back, but took increasingly high casualties. They did make it to 2 defensive redoubts, and their lines appeared to be holding now. This was until Benedict Arnold rode in, leading a charge of American forces. These defensive redoubts were held by some Canadian irregulars that had been raised from Canada, and they were decimated. Their final breakthrough forced the British to fully retreat back to Saratoga in haste. By the end of the day, the British had lost 900 men compared to the 150 lost for the Americans. Burgoyne now had an army of about 5,700 against an American army that now numbered 16,000 men. He was outnumbered 3-1. Realizing that he was now out of options, hopelessly outnumbered, out of supplies, and that no help was coming, he authorized a retreat of his army all the way back to Canada. Perhaps he would be able to reach Fort Ticonderoga, where there was a sizable British garrison. He could replenish some of his numbers there and hold a great defensive position. He may have to retreat and give up most of his gains, but Saratoga would be about as far north as he would go. He also received word that St. Leger's army was making its way through Canada to reinforce him. Perhaps they could meet up at Ticonderoga. His army could then probably hit about 8,000 to 9,000 troops, and defending would be much easier. His retreat would spell doom for this campaign into New York for this year, but holding the upper Hudson and keeping Ticonderoga would make sure that the rebels couldn't reinvade Canada and would pin down troops that Washington desperately needed in Pennsylvania. He could still count this as a victory. Perhaps he could try again next spring. He reached Saratoga to grab his garrison and head north. He was met, though, with the news that there would be no retreat. American forces had moved around his flanks and cut his army off. He was surrounded. While Burgoyne's army was fighting south of Saratoga, General Lincoln had raised 2,000 troops and marched around him to attack Fort Ticonderoga. He didn't take the fort, but successfully closed off the passages of supply and communication from it to Burgoyne. He received a letter from Gates telling him about the fighting that there was in Saratoga, and he immediately marched south to pen in Burgoyne. On October 17th, 5 months after the beginning of this campaign, John Burgoyne became the first British general to surrender a British army in modern history. He marched out of Saratoga with his 6,000 men with full military honors and into their imprisonment in Virginia. It's hard to overstate how important the victory at Saratoga was then and still is now. The ripple effects of this single battle can still be felt today. With Burgoyne's army out of the field, the predicament for the British Empire in North America became very tenuous. Canada once again became vulnerable, and it became very clear that the revolution would not be over anytime soon. The war would go on, and it would be costly in both men and material. For the Americans, this battle came at a time when the very survival of the nation was at stake. For the people involved, though, things were not all well. Something that will be, again, covered in another video. For a brief second, the Continental Congress could take a sigh of relief, but things were happening across the ocean. Now all eyes turned towards France.